Tuatahi tautoko o ngā mihi, kua mihi a ki a koutou, kua tai mai nei, tautoko o te pōhiri, e pōhiri tia, ki a koutou ina nahi, ki a tātou ina nahi, Ngāti whātua, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou. Yesterday we had the pōwhiri, or actually it was a whakatau here, which is a particular kind of greeting. The pōwhiri is generally more fully fledged, onto the marae with all of you being called in. And when we arrived here yesterday and nearly everyone was sitting in the room, I was like, oh, what's going on? Because normally we would have made you all wait outside and then we would have called you all in. So a whakatau is what we had yesterday. And whakatau means to settle you down, to bring you in, to acknowledge you, to affirm you, and to settle you. And so it was a real honour for us, for Rihi and I, who have lived here on Ngāti Whātua land for many years. I lived here for 25 years, and in my reply yesterday, which I chose not to translate, for a number of reasons, one being that everyone who lives on this land should have understood me. If we had an education system that worked in this country, everyone that was in this room would have understood me from this country. And I think that, so I'm going to kind of go all over a little bit, but I think that, that's really significant for our children and our grandchildren, the current debate around Māori language in schools, because everyone has a right to understand the language of the land in the way that we would if we were in France or Italy or any other country that has a first language other than English. So I chose deliberately not to translate, but I did want to really put in context an acknowledgement of what we did yesterday. So one of the really key things is an acknowledgement of the ancestors in the room. And when we talk about being emotional, which is generally coined as a put down in meetings, and when we talk about being spiritual, as a Māori person or as a Māori woman, when we come into a space with this many people, we bring our ancestors with us. And so in the call, in the karanga, we're actually greeting our ancestors. They've come into the room both with the home people and the visitors. So in our terms, at the moment in this room, we think this room is full. You should see the spiritual room. Because actually all of our ancestors that travel with us, whether we believe in that or not, because they travel with us whether we know it or not, are actually having a whole other level of meeting and greeting and working things out on our behalf on the spiritual realm. So I really want to acknowledge from our ancestors to all of your ancestors that are gathered here. Which way am I pointing? So, no taranaki a hai, ko taranaki te maunga, ko karioi hoki, ko waitara, ko waikato ngā awa, ko te atiawa ko Ngāti Māhanga, ko ngā māhanga tairi o ku iwi, ko Ngāti Rāhiri tōku hapu, and nei tētahi mokopuna o te maunga tītohia. So I originate from Taranaki, and I have connections in Waikato to Karioi Mountain, for those who know that area around Raglan. My tribal affiliations are Te Atiawa, Ngāti Māhanga, and ngā māhanga tairi. And mahanga means twins, and I'm the mother of 6 children. I have 26-year-old twins, go figure, a 22-year-old daughter, a 13-year-old daughter, and the 9-year-old twins. So I have 2 tribal twin affiliations, and I have 2 sets of twins. I did not birth them all, because I believe in whāngai, but also I'm a lesbian woman, so I have partners who also had children, birth children. So of my 6 children, we have quite a diverse and eclectic kind of grouping. My oldest twin boys, I birthed. Lillian is Pākehā. She's a young 22-year-old Pākehā woman. She is fluent in Māori. She knows her place. She never tries to be a Māori person, because I keep saying to her, good people are good people. You can be a good Pākehā person living on Māori land. And that's, I think, a really important message for people to understand. We don't need people to be like us. We just want a way to build meaningful and embedded and deep relationships with each other for the well-being of all people in this land. And then I have a 13-year-old daughter who we adopted. And because lesbians can't adopt in this country, my ex-partner was the only one who could put her name on the adoption. And she's Samoan Māori, and her grandmother is a very good friend of mine. And then we have 9-year-old twins. So we have a really diverse family, and when we move around together, people can't quite work us out. Then I'm really fortunate to have sons who I'm right into teenage birthing, teenage parents, because I got grandchildren at a point where I actually can spend really good time with them. So I have my oldest grandchild is coming up to 5, and the youngest will be born in October. So this is the title I gave for this talk, and it comes from some work we've been doing at the University of Waikato. I'm currently a director of Te Kotahi Research Institute at the University of Waikato. It's the only interdisciplinary cross-faculty institute in the university. And we had our own conference last week, an Indigenous Research Conference, and we looked at this theme. He pukina wai, he nohonga tangata, he pukinga kōrero. And I wanted to have that theme because I wanted to link to water. And I wanted to link to what water means to us as a people. And to acknowledge that in the gathering, what this proverbial saying, this whakatauki says to us, is that where the waters gather and people gather, conversations are engaged, conversation flows. And that really, for me, is the crux of this gathering, is that gathering together, we have an opportunity to network, to have dialogue, to engage, and to have conversations that flow like the waters that flow under these lands. So the first conversation I wanted to have was around the role of women. And we've heard a lot of conversations on the stage around being confident, about being okay with being emotional, about being strong in the networking as women. Being from Taranaki, this is a very old saying. This is from Te Whiti in 1880. And Te Whiti was one of the leaders of the movement in Parihaka, which was a peaceful activist community before the initial invasion in Taranaki. So in 1880, when that village was invaded by colonial forces, all of the men were taken to Dunedin in shackles, on boats, and they were jailed in caves in Dunedin. So people from here that know the geography of what that means, it's quite significant. And before Te Whiti was taken, he said to some of the women, "E tūtama wahine I te wā o te kore." Te wā o te kore is the disappearing time. So he's referring to the disappearance of the men. So what he's saying is that women will stand in all of the male roles and every role required, because there will be no men to do it. So he's saying, as a leader, it is up to the woman of this territory to do everything that is required. So having that kind of cultural background makes it really easy for me to see the role of women in taking on significant positions, whether it be leadership, whatever it is, within our communities, not only because we have a right to, but also because we have an obligation to. So one of the stories from yesterday that I shared to Sharon and Ngāti Whātua was that I lived here for 25 years on Ngāti Whātua land. And many of us don't know the history of the land that we're even sitting on in this room. So very early on in our colonial history, one of the ancestors of the woman that sat here in the pōwhiri gifted a huge block of what is now Auckland City, gifted it for the establishment of the first colonial parliament. And that was Ngāti Whātua ancestors. And what they got in return for the gifting of that land was that all of the other lands were confiscated. So, in acknowledging Ngāti Whātua, it's more than just acknowledging you are the tribal group of this territory, it's acknowledging the history that comes every time we walk up Queen Street, every time we walk around the viaduct. And it has taken them 150 years to rebuild to this whare. How many people have been up onto the point to this marae? So there's a few, but not many, but there's a few. It's a beautiful, I mean, you can see why it was confiscated, right? It's stunning. And this is these are just two of the names for the Auckland region. Tāmaki Makaurau, Tāmaki, a place of many lovers. Yes, I'm into decolonial love. Multiple lovers is a good thing. But they're actually referring to the land and the waters, that this territory was desired after by many. Tāmaki Makaurau. It's a beautiful name. So, I tend to use Tāmaki rather than Auckland, because Auckland for me does not actually have a meaning in terms of the connectedness to this land. Tāmaki here ngā waka. Tāmaki, the place where all the waka wanted to be tied. So everyone wanted to come here to this, and we just have to look out the window to know why that is. And I was listening to Vicky, and it just really resonated, this whole idea of radical generosity. How much more radical can you be in your generosity than to gift an entire city to a nation? And we would call that manaakitanga. The way that you care for people, the way that you care for people living in your land, the way that you care for guests, the way that you welcome their ancestors. So I think we have a really great frame here already of radical generosity. But I just think we haven't delved into that knowledge to enable us to see that for what it is. The other thing that's really hit me, kind of being at this point as a speaker, I've been able to kind of adapt to some of the earlier discussions. And one of them is a saying from Te Puia Hirangi, mahia te mahi hei painga mo te iwi. So you do the work you do for collective well-being. And I've heard more and more in the past few sessions around our need to collectively support, our need to collectively network, our need to consider asking for help. Because it's amazing watching the workshop at how many people were willing to give it. How many people were generous enough with their networks and their thinking and their support to say, I can do that for you, when people ask for help. And it reminded me, really very much of Te Puia. So Te Puia was a major leader for Waikato Tainui, and her entire goal was around the well-being of the collective. She adopted whāngai, took care of, fed, housed, cared for over 100 children in her lifetime. And she built Tūranga Waiwai, so the marae of the kingitanga. Te Puia was totally dedicated to collective well-being. And it's not about denying individuals' desire or passion, but it's about connecting individuals within a collective. And I've heard that with Nihar, I've heard that with Denise, and I've heard that with Vicky in the talks that you've done. How do we bring together our individual passions into a collective networking? So we've been very fortunate, in my view, within Waikato Tainui, within the tribal region and beyond, to have models of this culturally that are very deeply embedded in this ground, in this earth, in this land, and in the cultural frame that we have. So we've got a lot to do in terms of changing education in this country, because I think, we should all know this. We should all know this. We should all know Te Puia. We should all know the history. We should all know what happened here in Tāmaki. We should know the names of these places. We are all collectively being denied a history of this land that will benefit all of us in terms of our relationships. So another saying that I really wanted to pick up on in terms of the collective well-being is e hara taku tō i te tō takitahi, ko taku tō he tō takitini. So my success is not mine alone, but it's the success of the collective. So it's about coming together, to work together, to be successful in everything that we do. And it's very key to Māori well-being, and you'll kind of get that a little bit later when I go through some of the movements that we're involved in. But what we know is that collective voice has been very powerful in challenging some really fundamental injustices in this country. And Linda Smith, who I'm really fortunate to work with, Professor Linda Smith at the University of Waikato, is constantly reminding us that as a Māori woman, you're already on the edge of society. You know, you're already right there. And that edge cannot be an edge you have to fall off. That can be a cutting edge for change. It can be a cutting edge for transformation. So partly when I, talked to Teresa and Barbara about coming here, and I kind of got a sense of who would be speaking. I don't know if you remember that Sesame Street thing. It's kind of one of these things is not like the others. One of these things just doesn't belong. And I kind of felt like a little bit like that because, what I do is actually about conceptualising ideas, conceptualising change, and then supporting people in that work. So when Lindy said to me, what do you really do? I said, well, I think about thinking, and then I require and I work with other people to think more deeply about how they think about thinking. So, fundamentally, I'm a scholar and a researcher, but I'm also really committed to believing that we have traditional and ancestral knowledge on this land that is available to everybody if we look for it. That can really help transform some of our experiences. So, as Lihi said, a part of my life calling, so work and life for me is the same thing. When people talk about a work-life balance, I'm like, oh gosh, do you kind of get to do them differently? Because most people I know don't clock out at 5. And when you're doing things that you love, it's just part of your life. And everything I do is actually about my children, my grandchildren, my whānau, hapu and iwi. And so those are all collectives. And for me, if I do well for those things, I'll do well nationally for this country, because I have a fundamental belief that if we follow the trail and the views of our ancestors in terms of what is good for this land, it will benefit everyone who lives here. I have no doubt. I have total faith in that. And that if we do that, we can then be global in a whole other way by being both local and national. We can actually support globally. So we've been working with a number of global organisations, and we work in the background, supporting movements is really a lot of what we do. So the Women's March this year, I'm assuming that people have an awareness of the Women's March the day after the election, when that dude got in, anyway. The Women's March was a very powerful march, and it reminded me of a range of other very powerful movements. And Michelle did that joke about, Kate Shepherd should be a $8.80 bill. Well, actually, if Kate Shepherd was Māori, she would be a $7.70 bill. Because we need to remember, and I don't want to burst people's bubbles around unity, but within this grouping of women, there are entirely different experiences of injustice. And so I watched the Women's March, and I was really inspired by it, to see that many women mobilising, not only on Turtle Island, known as America, but also in other parts of the country, here and around the world. And then I immediately look for where are the Indigenous women in this movement? How are the Indigenous women locating? And there were very strong Indigenous Women's Rise group were in the group, and there were very strong Indigenous women's groups in the march. And the march organisers were very multicultural. And so they talked about this idea of intersectionality. And it's not a term we use a lot here, but it's actually a very old, well, it's an oldish term. It comes from the 80s, and it's really around how do we work across within groups of women, particularly, it's a particularly feminist view, how do we work to ensure that race and gender and sexuality and identity and class and all of those mixtures of who we are as women, how do we work across that in a way that keeps everybody well in the collective? So what does intersectionality mean in a kind of movement? When we talk about women, and we know that there is a difference in pay rate for Māori and Pacific women than there are to Whākia women, how do we negotiate that if we keep talking about this kind of homogenous group of women, but how do we negotiate it in a way that we don't just totally fragment everything? So it got me really thinking about this talk around how do we think about intersectionality as Indigenous women. And it really has hit me that we think about it often in how we can support movements, as in other Indigenous movements. So thinking locally about what happens here, but understanding globally that we have a contribution. So Idle No More is a movement. So the piece of work on the left-hand side comes from here. It's from Robin Kahukiwa, a very well-known Māori woman artist. The one from the right comes from Turtle Island, from the part of Turtle Island they call Canada. And so Idle No More was a movement developed by 4 Indigenous women. And it was developed after an omnibus bill that was around the riverways in Canada and an impact on the river. And so Sylvia McAdams is a woman from Idle No More who was a founding member of that organisation, who came and spoke with us last week in Hamilton. And her daughter beaded this, and if you know Indigenous nations and beading in Turtle Island, it's a huge honour to be gifted something that is beaded in this manner. So this was gifted not to me individually, but to our institute. And Idle No More is an organisation that is based in Canada, but that globally Indigenous women have been supporting. The other one is Mauna Kea. So I'm raising this because I think these are issues that really we should all know about. Because these are issues of well-being. They're issues of water, they're issues of sacred sites, they're issues of well-being of Indigenous nations. And issues of well-being for Indigenous nations become issues of well-being for everyone on the land, for everybody who lives here. So Mauna Kea is around protecting a sacred mountain on the island of Hawaii, where they want to build a new telescope. So the discourse creates it as a debate between science and sacred sites. But actually it's more than that. It's about a disrespect of Indigenous nations on their own land. And I'm glad Niha's arrived because it reminded me of the agreement scale. What happens when you are people who have treaties and your treaty partner operates at a number 1 in the honouring of your treaty? And when I sat listening to your talk this morning, I really reflected on where are we as treaty partners across the world? What level are we at in an agreement scale? Because for me, part of making agreements is about a commitment to that agreement. And I think that commitment moves you from a 3 to a 5, generally. But the other part is that when you're in agreement as collectives, it's about honour. It's about being honourable. It's about honouring your agreement. It's about honouring your treaty. So for Mauna Kea, which is led by, these are really led by women. That's why I want to talk about these particular struggles. Pua Case is one of a family who is totally committed to this. She left her job, she has given everything away, and she is totally committed to the well-being of this mountain. To build this telescope will be 30 stories high. It will be the equivalent of a 30-story high building. In order to build it, they will have to make a hole in the mountain that can sit, a stadium that could sit 50,000 people. This is a big movement. Standing Rock, or the No Dapple movement, in terms of the Sioux lands and the pipeline going through their lands. Again, significant women's leadership in all of these issues. This particular struggle is about water. This particular struggle is about not only the well-being of the reservation people in the river, but of at least 3 to 5 million people downriver. These are struggles that we really, if you don't watch Al Jazeera or Democracy Now or some kind of online radical television, we get fed CNN TV and Fox News in this country. We actually have to, in my view, to know about this stuff, go much more broadly, and that be more broad in our thinking, be more broad in our media, and the way in which we understand things. But this movement was really established to protect the land, but it's become an Indigenous movement because the community is Indigenous in terms of where they want to cross that particular pipeline. Aboriginal Australia has been fighting for many years around the removal of children. So we brought Larissa Berendt, an Aboriginal woman, last week to speak to these issues. This is not a new thing. This is a repeat of a stolen generation. So anyone that saw Rabbit Proof Fence, the film, gets an understanding of the stolen generation. But we are talking about thousands and thousands of Aboriginal children forcibly removed from their lands. And the impact of that is still being felt as people are trying to reconnect to their own communities. So we have a 2017 version of this happening in Australia right now. And we don't know anything about it. We don't know what is happening, and we don't have an opportunity to make a collective statement as people in terms of that struggle and in terms of what is happening. And as a grandparent, I find it incredibly painful to watch what is happening with Aboriginal children and with the forced closures of Aboriginal communities. So because you live in a remote community, you are of no economic value in a neoliberal framework. So it's not just broken, it's more than broken. It's an oppressive framework that denies people's ability to live in the way that they choose to live. So if you're in remote Aboriginal communities, you stand the risk of having all of your utilities closed. So no water, no electricity, and if you don't move to the cities, well, too bad. So these are our neighbours. But even worse is that it's actually happening here in terms of the removal of children. So the current movement by the Ministry of Social Development, Minister Anne Tolley, and the rewriting of child, youth and family, and I don't know how many people here have ever had children in that system. Only me? Yep. It is a really difficult system to negotiate. It is a really difficult system to ever be allowed to make improvements to get your children back. You can do everything the system tells you, and you can never prove that you're a good enough parent to have your child back. So in this country, we have a new law that will remove the ability to make the government accountable to Māori families and whānau to have children placed with their own people. So last week we saw a general back down by the minister in terms of this, but the movements that we've been pushing in terms of hands off our tamariki are not convinced. They're not convinced that the Minister is actually going to operationalise this need to connect children to their whānau. So what we're saying is, and we're going to talk a bit about this in the workshop tomorrow, whānau is not family, okay? Many organisations go family, whānau. Whānau is not family. Whānau is an extended family system. There's at least 3 to 4 generations. It includes grandparents, great aunties, great uncles, cousins a few times removed. It's as wide as we want it, it's as deep as we want it. So what we're saying to this government at the moment is that you cannot tell me that in 4 generations, both deep and wide, you cannot find one healthy person in that whānau that can help raise this child. Because I won't accept that. And actually, Andrew Beecroft, the Minister, the Commissioner for Children, he also does not accept that. And he's a white man. But he's been a family court judge for many years, and he knows that it goes beyond what most social workers can do. What do we need to do about that? We need to be collectively appalled by this. We need to be collectively appalled by this. And the way that we do that is to understand that if this was your child, if this was your grandchild, where would you want your grandchild to be? And I know where I want my grandchildren to be, and I would fight to the death for them to be with me, if by some reason my children could not raise them. So this can happen to anyone at any time. Another women's movement, so there are a number of movements that we link to in terms of the work we do, and that we support by trying to raise kind of awareness, a collective awareness, amongst people like the woman in this room, who may not ever have heard about this before. But justice for missing and murdered Indigenous women in Canada. Over 1,400 Indigenous women have disappeared in Canada, either murdered or missing. So when we talk about human trafficking, when we talk about what's happening in the mining camps, all of these things that happen often go unheard of, because Indigenous women, on the whole in this context, are seen to be not that important, are seen to not be as important enough to actually even have the police or the authorities try to work out where they might be. So there's this really growing movement around coming to understand that as women, if we're talking about collective women, if we're talking about world women, knowing these movements, knowing what is happening with these women, and offering support. And it can be as small as an email to say, if you need any support, we are here. It can be the offering rather than asking. It can be the generosity in terms of supporting those women who are leading these movements. And then we come home to things like pride in prison. Mona Jackson did some research in 1988 around Māori in prison. And what he found then was that Māori men were around 50% of the prison population, right? And we're about, 14% of the population? And at that time, we were appalled. He's just redone that report nearly 30 years later, and he said, Leonie, there's no change. Māori men are still around 50% of the population, prison population. He said the biggest change is that in 1988, Māori women were around 13 to 14% of the prison population. We are now 60% of the prison population. So what's happened in 30 years that has increased that figure for Māori women in prison? It just doesn't make any sense to me. There is something very wrong with our system. But there's small groups and pockets of groups that are actually working to try and change it. One is No Pride in Prisons, in terms of the work that they're doing. Other issues here, in terms of the issues of transgender rights, so transgender women being locked in men's prisons. These are issues for all women, not only for Māori women. We should all be asking, how can one part of this woman's population be so representative in the prison system? How can that be? And what are we going to do about it? The Black Lives Matter movement, again, initially formed by women, by African American women. So often we see snippets around these movements, but we don't realise that actually many of the women that began this movement are the mothers of the children that have been shot by the police. Trayvon Martin's mother, a whole range of mothers. And for those of you who watched the Women's March, though many of those mothers spoke at the Women's March. Women trying to get justice for their children. Women trying to get access to support for their children. Oak Flats, Apache land, it just goes on and on. These are issues that Indigenous nations are working together to try and resolve and have been doing for many, many years. What we don't see in these movements are very many allies. And that's really why I've chosen to speak about these things in this particular gathering. Because when I watched the different conversations and the sessions this morning, I watched, and yesterday, the way in which women in this room really responded to Cambodia, really responded to this notion of being collective and supporting other women in business development and networking, really responded to this idea of the way in which emotional pain can cause ill health. And because I want to come back to all of those things just in a moment. So it seemed to me that this would be the place to talk about some really critical. We need you and your collectives that you're a part of to think about responding to. You can't respond to all of these. We're not all superwomen. Some of us do respond to all of these, but for me, they're all interconnected. They're all fundamentally the same thing. They're fundamentally about injustice that our people experience on their own lands. So it's easy for me and others to connect across all of these. Through to West Papua, Indonesian soldiers are raping a Papuan woman every day. And this country does nothing about it. We have no one in this country actively, in the government itself, actively stating this is not okay. What can we do about this? And then on our own land, again. So we've gone from Ngāti Whātua back to where I'm from, which is Taranaki. So does anyone know what yesterday... I don't want the Māori woman in this room to respond to this question. Does anyone know the significance of yesterday, March 17th, in this country? Anyone? No, you're not allowed to either, because we've had a conversation. Close. It was when they came to Waitara. Yeah. So March the 17th, 1860, was the beginning of the first land wars in this country, in the town of Waitara, where I'm from, on the block called Peka Peka. So it's been 157 years since the confiscation of that block and since the beginning of those wars, yesterday. We should know this, you know. I mean, this is not about you individually. This is about a system that means we don't know this. We should know this. Because I think that if we knew this, we would have much more meaningful relationships with each other in our communities if we knew this. You know, we would be able to actually understand and connect to some people's pain that we don't currently connect to because we don't understand it and we can't locate it in our experience. So I was born and raised in this town. We've been an active part of pushing for the return of this land. This land was removed from the Te Atiawa Treaty Settlement because they didn't know how to deal with it. And what the Crown said to Te Atiawa, which is our tribal group, if you want this land back, you can have it, but we're going to reduce your settlement by $23 million. So what they're effectively saying is, if you want your land back that we stole, that we acknowledged in every single report that we stole, that we've put an apology in your treaty settlement saying we stole it, but if you want it back, you have to buy it back. And so the iwi said, no, we're not going to buy it back. And in fact, we'll take every reference to it out of the treaty process, the settlement process. So this land sits outside of it. So we now have the New Plymouth District Council and the Taranaki Regional Council, because this is leased land, they're now wanting to freehold it so that they can get $69 million into their coffers. So this is a 157-year battle. So where I would love to be an entrepreneur and be doing other things, I have a 157-year battle. So I love 20-year plans. But I tell you, our tupuna, our ancestors have been doing 150-year plans for some time. And in fact, the treaty in 1840 was a future planning document. It was a strategic document for this. If we think about this in business terms, it was a strategic planning document for 1,000 years for this country. And actually, if we honoured it, if we had a number 5 agreement that had honour with it, we would be in a totally different place in this country right now. So I guess what I'm asking is, when we think about these things around agreement, when we think about these things around relationships, there are a whole range of wider places they can be taken for the well-being of Aotearoa more generally. And when I look at my whānau, I'm talking about my whānau just in my children and my grandchildren. I'm talking about Māori children and grandchildren, Samoan children and grandchildren, Pākehā children, just in mine alone. So I have every reason to ensure that everyone benefits from a good treaty relationship in this country. And then Neha, really, I added this actually after her talk, because one of the things that we understand in this country is we understand stress and what stress does to it. And I thought it was a really great talk this morning, because sometimes you need that kind of medical knowledge to enhance the kind of conceptual knowledge that we're talking about and the traditional knowledge. So we understand that when you're stressed, you're more likely to have a heart attack, you're more likely to have alcohol use, drug use, mental health issues, all these things we get, right? We know in this country, and studies tell us, that after the Christchurch earthquake, there was an increase in alcohol use, drug use, family violence, smoking, heart issues. Everything went through the roof. People who had given up smoking for 20 years started smoking again. People started finding more aggression and more violence in their family context. It's a bit like when the All Blacks don't win the World Cup. Farah, where is she? And there are stats to tell us that. When the All Blacks don't win the World Cup, there are a whole lot of other things that happen afterward. Alcoholism, family violence, a whole range of things happen. So we're all going, please win, please win. When you're working in the family violence, you want them to win. So you don't have to deal with the aftermath of what comes. But just coming back to the thing of pain and what pain does. If we understand that stress can do that in this current life, the movements that I've just shared with you are movements for justice on Turtle Island. So when I say Turtle Island, I mean Canada, the Americas, and part of South America, because they were all one territory before anyone started building walls and redefining the boundaries, right? But there, we're talking about an intergenerational stress that native people have been experiencing for 500 years. We're talking about here in Waitara alone, where I'm from, of an intergenerational stress that our people have been experiencing for 157 years. Now, when we understand that, we are talking about the equivalent of 157 earthquakes on that Māori community. So when we're talking about that, we're talking about a historical wound. We're talking about what Maria Yellowhorse Braveheart and her sister in doing their work talk about in terms of historical trauma and emotional and a psychological wounding that gets passed across generations. And that Eduardo Duran talks about as an Indigenous psychology as a soul wound, a deep embedded soul wound. And that when we do what we do to the earth, we're doing an earth wounding. And when you wound the earth, you wound the people of that place. And we can understand that when we're... So in Taranaki, there are a lot of farmers that live on the edge of fracking. Now, they never really understood the impact of what happened in Taranaki until they experienced that kind of wounding. And then immediately they knew the pain of what that means. That the land that you have loved and cared for is all of a sudden deeply wounded. So these are the things that many Indigenous people and women carry every day of our lives. So I'm not giving you a happy ending, because this is the kind of thing that we need your help with. We need good allies with. Someone said to me before around the Question Our group, Leonie, do you have a question? I said, no, I'm really thinking about what I'm about to do. So actually I do have a question. And it is, how many people are willing to step up to help the healing of this kind of wounding in all of the nations around the world? But starting firstly with here, starting firstly with this country. If we can heal the wounding in this country, then we will have the kind of country that I hear people say we have, and I think, oh, is that where I live? The non-racist, non-sexist, egalitarian society. I'm thinking, that is not a recognisable definition for me of this country. But it is a vision that we should have for this country. Because by virtue of being very small, and by virtue of actually being very active and very practical in many ways, we can actually do that in this country. And we can do it in the same way that people are doing it globally, in small pockets, building out regionally. So I want to go back to Te Puia just to close. And again, because I connect to Waikato Tainui, it's really, this has always resonated with me. And, it is around, you can read that, it is around a collective vision and a collective dreaming. It is about relying on collective power to make change, not just for some women, but for all women. Not just for some groups in this room, but for everyone in this room. Only you can know what that might look like for you. And this is not a judgment call. This is about saying we have these things happening right on our own back door, and we actually do need some help. We do need people who know Anne Tolley in this room to say to her, Māori whānau and Māori children need their identity. They need their culture. They need to be connected. If you do not want to repeat what happened with closed adoptions in the 1960s, which is really what we're heading for, then you have to do something now to change what is happening in the development of the SIFS law. You have to take your hands off our tamariki. You have to acknowledge whānau's ability to make good decisions. Because most of us in this room, we don't get that on TV when we see about Māori families. We get the beaten up, you kill your children, we get everything that is wrong with us. So I really want you to take everything you see on television about what's wrong with us and just remember that's a pathological kind of deficit view, and actually there are many whānau that don't live like that, and that those that need the kind of collective help that you can give and support that you can give, actually I've already been asking. We've been asking for 150 years. Some have been asking for 200 years. We barely get a level 1 agreement. We barely get an acknowledgement, and it's good to have this language to use, but we barely get an acknowledgement, let alone a positive interest in what we're doing. And I think that's a really good framework to think about how can we contribute to change? How can we do things that are different in this country? In terms of, this is what we do, transforming lives. How can we contribute to transforming lives? And we're here and we're really interested in hearing what people do, what women are doing. And I did want to say, because Denise talked about the World Women Development possibly after this, is that I really want to ensure Teresa and everyone, Barbara and Lindy's my mate, we want meaningful engagement in that. We as Māori women, we want meaningful engagement in that development. We want to bring Māori women to the table in a really meaningful way. And if we're looking at how we're doing things in our communities, in terms of Māori women's involvement with anything you do, it's actually about meaningful relationships. And it has to be about really developing close relationships that are meaningful and deep and positive and actually are about being real partners in the way that the treaty envisaged. So Moana Jackson said something a few weeks ago at another conference I was at, and he said, Leonie, that one of the issues in this country is that we think that in terms of the Treaty of Waitangi, we think the treaty has to be settled. Because if you settle it, then all these tribes will stop asking for things. Well, treaties are not made to be settled, is what he said. Treaties are made to be honoured. So when we get to a point that we can actually have really honourable and meaningful relationships, which we are all quite capable of doing in this room, because I've watched you all networking. So I know every woman in this room can do this. Then actually, I think we're going to find communities that live better together, that work better together, that raise children better together, and that actually aspire to a future that is good for all. Tēnā koutou.